All right, we're here with No Name Explorations. No spaces, No Name Explorations on YouTube. The channel with over 200 subscribers and 200 videos and nearing 300, I think. And we're here with the humble host, Nick.
Hello, hello, hello. It's actually, I just put up my 300th video a couple days ago.
All
So
right.
that's pretty cool. The channel basically focuses on history of Washington State and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico because I don't like to be here in Washington in the winter because it's very miserable and it's nice and warm there. So I kind of go to cemeteries and look at historical stuff in both areas. Mainly cemeteries, but I also like abandoned things, farmhouses, buildings, so on and so forth.
Yeah. When did you start?
Probably about 9 years ago, I went hiking with a buddy from high school, and we were driving to in between two towns, one being Grand Coulee and the other being Coulee City, and he pulled off on the side of the road one day and wanted to follow this waterfall. So we did, and we followed it all the way up to the top of the plateau, and it was really cool because there was 7 or 8 waterfalls that went up the mountainside. And then I went back with somebody else a few days later and just went farther, and I found an abandoned farmhouse, which was the first one I ever found. And that pretty much got me interested in the farmers' homesteads out in Washington State.
And when did you start the YouTube channel?
About 2 years ago.
Okay, so 300 videos in 2 years, and it started out with a big focus on the homesteads, farmers' homes, but then what happened? How did it transition into cemeteries?
Well, as I was looking around in different areas in Washington State and finding these old farmhouses, there were a number of them that I began discovering had family cemeteries in the backyards or on properties nearby. And I first started researching the cemeteries, hoping to find some information on the people that lived in the abandoned farmhouses themselves. But eventually it morphed into something a lot more. I became more obsessed and focused on the cemeteries and the farmhouses, and mainly too seeing that there's a lot more material looking at the cemeteries than the abandoned farmhouses.
So the first farmhouse you found by chance. You followed a dirt road.
It was it's called the Chase Draw Farmhouse, and if you look on my YouTube channel, it goes under, the episode is called Drought House, but I forget what episode it is actually off the top of my head, but it's up on top of the plateau in between Grand Coulee and Coulee City, basically. And yes, I was walking up there with a friend and we stumbled upon it. And since then, I've been there 8, 9, 10 times.
And from there, how did you find subsequent houses?
Google Maps. Basically, I learned how to spot them, and I just meticulously looked through the entire Pacific Northwest and marked down as many of them as I could find. And
so zooming in and recognizing what the satellite image of a old dilapidated
yes I'd look
structure
for structures and trees. There's giveaways as you get more experienced, and of course when I first started it was a lot harder to find these houses than like now. I could find them pretty quick if I just go look on the outskirts of different towns.
You start to recognize a pattern. Yes. Here's where a house would be. Here's where a family cemetery would be.
Yes. And that helped me out a lot. And so I've probably gone to a good 4 dozen abandoned farmhouses in the Washington State area. And It's something I'm gonna go back to since I got my new camera, and I'm gonna do some revisit episodes on my channel coming up over the next few months.
I think he said that like there's a tendency for the family graveyards at these homesteads to be in like this position in relation to the house. I don't want to say north or south, but maybe like if the house is here, the graveyard's lower or higher.
The graveyard seems to me it tends to be on higher ground usually, and a little bit away from the homestead. It'll usually be on the side of a road, side of an old dirt road, with a tree or two. They always seem to grow a tree as kind of a way to mark them. So when I have like an idea of where a cemetery could be and I'm walking around trying to find it, when I see an area that has a lone tree, that often is a good indication that there's a cemetery there. And they often had them, just like I said, right off the side of the roads is where I found most of these farmer cemeteries. And it's helped me understand the history of Washington State more, how all these different settlers came into Washington State in the 1800s from various European countries, and they all kind of kept to themselves. The Ukrainians have their place, the Russians have their place, the Germans have their place, the Finnish have their place, and they all kind of congregated together but in their own little groups, and each little town or settlement would have a church that was generally there by the cemetery, although many of them have fallen down at this point.
And I don't want to get these wrong, but yeah, I feel like Odessa maybe has a German town influence, German ancestry to it, and then somewhere outside of Wilbur, Davenport, Creston, somewhere there is more of a like Dutch or
yes. And even outside of Cooley City, I found a Danish cemetery, which I believe is episode 47 on my channel. The Danish cemetery.
So it gets complicated where you have like, all right, a family of immigrants came west from Europe, would have hit the east coast of the United States, then ended up making it one way or another all the way to the western side of the United States. And a lot of these gravestones, the person died in the 1800s. So, like, Washington only became a state in 1889. And there's only so much history you can find, but it's fascinating because, like, obviously they're like, hey, there's a lot of Dutch here, let's congregate here, or did they all coordinate, like, hundreds of miles back?
It was coordinated hundreds of miles back. My studies have showed me that they came from the eastern United States where they were already established, and they came to the western United States for various reasons. They believed that there was opportunity and money to be made. I'm actually even pretty sure the government was allotting people was
this Oregon Trail days?
Yes. Back in the Oregon Trail days. And then there were people that came to Washington State for many reasons. Confederate soldiers that were escaping persecution during, the post-Civil War days.
It's the Wild West,
came up here to the New West.
American expansion, it's Manifest Destiny.
And then during World War II, there was a huge immigration of Japanese people from the eastern United States because Washington didn't extradite or send them away during the time during World War II when they were discriminated against by the Roosevelt administration and sent to camps in America. Many of them fled to Washington because they were able to, kind of keep their freedoms and their rights more so in Washington. And then there were a couple people that I found buried in some of these old cemeteries that even committed crimes in the eastern United States and fled to Washington because there was no extradition at the time. So I studied one guy that killed somebody, and he ended up fleeing to Washington, and he never got charged because it was just, it was the Wild West at the time, essentially. The last frontier of the United States was the Pacific Northwest and Washington State.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of things come to mind from that. It's just, in the movies, it's, someone dies on the Oregon Trail of typhoid fever or something, and then you bury them and you put a cross and you put their hat on the cross, and then you drive off. But, like, there must have been less regulations then. Like, you could just bury, like, your... a sad aspect of the cemeteries is just that all the child graves, it's, like, small, or, like, you realize a lot of these people are dying young, and just, like, children, too. So, like, if your kid died and you're working in the middle of a wheat field of what might not even be a state yet...
Yeah, they
like
just buried
a territory,
people.
A northwest territory of Washington or whatever. You could just bury them. Did you have to get a signature and wait around for the coroner to come around?
And a lot of people just buried their loved ones. And I would say
Jebediah.
40% of the people buried in the pioneer cemeteries are young children, children 12 years down to infancy.
You think
at least
40%?
4 out of 10.
Jeez.
And because it was a lot of people forget when the first settlers came here to Washington State, there was no grid yet, so they had to survive the harsh winters,
infant mortality, and harsh winters, the stress of it all.
And back to what we were talking about when it comes to the different enclaves of people that immigrated here in groups, it was very church motivated. So, for example, in Odessa, German and Ukrainian immigrants immigrated to the eastern United States and established themselves there, and then they moved west in groups. So it would be a whole group of multiple already established Danish families that would move to Washington State, and they would just get their own part and farm, and they had their own little church and their own little cemetery. Especially if they were getting assigned, like the government wanted people to expand the West. And, so they were giving out land.
50 acres or whatever.
And what I believe they did, how they did it, was they had to accomplish a certain amount of things in order for the land to be theirs. So the government would allot them, let's say, 200 acres of land, but in order for it to be theirs, they had to build a house, set up a water system, do this, and that, pave roads. So it was kind of a system like that where people came here.
We'll give you a house, but you have to do this.
Yes. And that's how it expanded and turned into a giant farming community full of a bunch of different little enclaves of different people that spoke different languages and different versions of Christianity.
Yeah, here's the Presbyterian section or whatever.
And the Catholics were here, and, so on and so forth.
Town. Yeah.
Yes, and then there were also stories of people that came here thinking that they were going to get riches. Because I think some of the newspapers out east embellished on what the Pacific Northwest was going to be like. And
some
a lot
propaganda.
of people...
There's gold in them hills.
And a lot of people came here hoping to strike it rich, and it didn't work out because the weather here is very harsh, especially before the dam, when they had to get a lot of their supplies shipped out here or delivered out here. And it was, I've heard accounts of historical accounts of people.
All right, so we were just talking about people getting supplies in isolated areas. So I was going to mention, I think it was around Northrop Canyon, again, between Grand Coulee and Coulee City, that they used to have to go to Elmira to get like a bucket of lard and a barrel of flour, and just these absurd things, because they had whatever vegetables and other stuff they needed, but they needed or animal meat, livestock meat, but they needed, lard and flour is what they needed.
Yes, bulk supplies, because back then they could only go to town so many times a year. So they had to be very careful.
And exploring those homesteads, I mean, it's like you and I have always had those that respect for it, of like there's you find antiques, but you don't take them. But yeah, you see bottles that are like Harry's hair tonic or something. It'll say something bizarre like oil or I don't know, matches or beans.
And a lot of the material that they use to build the houses can help timestamp them too.
Yeah.
There are some of the farmhouses that use pretty strong boards that are still nice and solid to this day, in spite of all the weather damage that they've taken. But then there's other houses that were a little older that were more small boards and chicken wire and plaster.
Yeah.
And so there were different building techniques that represented different eras, from the 1800s all the way up to the early 1900s as well.
I was a big fan of the show Mad Men, and some set decorator was saying even though the show takes place in the early 60s, a house at that time wouldn't just have everything made in 1960. It would have some antiques from the 30s and some antiques from the 1910s, and just like a house today has some family antiques,
stuff from the 80s
mixed with the new. There's some 80s stuff, and there's some 2024 stuff.
And a lot of the farmhouses too, the different building styles were economics as well. Mm-hmm. Some people had more money than others, hence they got better building material to put their house up than somebody who didn't have as much money.
Well, I think you've shown that there's sometimes there'd be a common wallpaper or something like that between a homestead here and a homestead 40 miles down the road.
Yes.
So they must have got it from the same
store
salesman, the same store time. Around the same time.
Yes.
And then wasn't there something I don't quite remember, so hopefully this makes sense, but they'd have a wall, but then they'd put up their extra sturdy wall, and then you could kind of tell, because sometimes that you could see behind one wall to the wall they used to have. Or does that make any sense at all?
Yes, well, and a lot of it was how they built houses at that specific time, and with the materials that they had, because a lot of it they used plaster that they don't use anymore. Mm-hmm. And something else that I found was interesting is they really recycled everything that they had. A lot of times they would board up a wall and then put a sheet cloth over that, and then plaster over that just for extra insulation, or they would crumple up newspapers and stick them in between the walls, or different pieces of cloth, just whatever they could, just to help insulate it, because there wasn't a hardware store to go get insulation.
So that old
or
sheet that they had came in handy.
Yes, they reused it. There were no clothes that got thrown away, or sheets that got thrown away, or any material was valuable to them at that time. And most of their almost all their roofs were cedar shake shingles, and so, which is partially why, since they've been abandoned for so long, they're deteriorating so bad, is because once those shingles blow off because of the high wind rate in the area, it exposes the roof. So water gets in there during a snow or during a rain and really just starts deteriorating the house faster, as opposed to a house that's built with a roof in today's world where the whole roof is sheeted and then composite or metal gets put on it. When those cedar shakes blow off, it literally exposes
There's just literally
half the
a
roof.
hole in the
Half the roof
ceiling.
is exposed. So, and
Yeah.
you know, that's how they did it in those times, and they worked with what they had, and everything was reused and recycled. And another thing that helped me find the houses as it pertains to even the first house that I went to that I talked about earlier that I found with you.
Mm-hmm.
They tended back in the days to build their farmhouses next to draws,
Right.
because there were no pipes of water being, you know, distributed to them. You didn't turn on the faucet
near a
and
creek,
the water.
so
Yes,
a valley naturally channels the water.
so
down.
they would find a spot there near a draw, but then even that had its problems, because there would be times where droughts would occur. And so people would lose everything. They would come out here and they would build a house and start an orchard and near a draw, but then it would dry up for 5 years and they'd go bankrupt and have to flee. And that's what I think happened in Drought House, because they had a bunch of trees all around the house, like they were growing fruit trees at one time, but then it looks like they just up and fled all of a sudden. And I think it was probably during the Dust Bowl era. It really hit hard here too.
Like a lot of this concentration of homesteads is within, I don't know, I'll say
100-mile radius.
100-mile radius.
From Spokane, Washington to Douglas, Washington to Moses Lake, Washington.
Yeah. So, like, I would imagine you've seen, like, some where you could tell the family was richer and some where the family was poorer, and, like, could you talk about, like, what's the difference?
Oh, yes, just the size. Mm-hmm. And not only the size, but the size of the bedrooms.
Yeah.
And the amount of levels to the house. Like if you look at my YouTube channel, you'll find I believe it's episode 30, Mansion House. You'll see one of the bigger houses out in this area, and it was owned by the Lafollettes, and they were one of the people that I was talking about earlier. They were a group of people that came here because the lure of riches. And it didn't quite work out for them, but they purchased a lot of land out in the Elmira, Wilbur area, and they built what I would consider a farmer's mansion for the time. It's 3 stories, at least 5 bedrooms, and everything's huge. The ceilings are high. It was just a big, nice farmhouse, and it's right down the street from the Lafollette Cemetery.
Do you think it's because they just started out with more money, or?
Yes, they had money to begin with, and they came out here to make more money.
Yeah.
But as legend has it, their first year here, when they came out and built that giant farmhouse out there in the middle of nowhere, they expected to go on one last supply run before the winter hit one year. And the winter hit earlier than expected, and everybody up in the area was basically trapped because, I mean, there were no real good highways around here. People were still using wagons. I mean, this was in the 1800s when people first started settling the area. So when you had a 4 or 5 foot snow and you're out in the middle of nowhere in Elmira, I mean, that's just where you were.
Yeah.
And good luck. And luckily there was a lady who's buried in the Lafollette Cemetery that lived in the area, and she was a strong, sturdy pioneer. I forget her name off the top of my head, but she had a lot of supplies, and she was prepared for a winter like that. And she helped not only the Lafollette family, which was a couple brothers and a sister, but other people in the area that settled there that year. She kept them alive because she had supplies and food to help get them through, or people might have starved.
So how are you learning and I'm sure there's a few ways.
Yeah, I read books at the local library. Find a grave on the internet has been very helpful. Google, and then I'll talk to people.
Yeah.
And I'll hear a story every once in a while that makes sense.
So, like the Lafayette story, for example, that you learned that there was this harsh winter. How did you learn about that?
I learned it from a book.
I see.
A book in the library about the old Grand Coulee, and it spoke about the Lafayettes, just a couple paragraphs, but it was enough for me to get a picture. So different things like that. For example, I have a Elmira history book that's kind of a staple for me when I'm around the area researching the cemeteries and the farmhouses and stuff.
Yeah.
Get information from many sources like that.
Have you talked to many of the families, or a lot of times an old homestead is by the new farmhouse?
Yes.
Have you talked to any of the families of the people in the graveyard, or shown them your videos, or
well, kind of unfortunately, most of that kind of history is lost to the sands of time now, because back when people first settled here, there were a lot more people here and a lot more houses. But as technology has progressed and we have
farms
the combines,
buy up another farm,
yes, one farmer could do what 10 farmers. It used to take 10 farmers to do. So slowly throughout the years, different farms have been sold off to different people.
So if you're filming the Wilson Cemetery, this guy's name is Barryson.
And he bought from somebody that bought from the Wilsons.
Yeah.
So it's the guy that I'm talking to now generally has less historical knowledge on the cemetery than I do.
Yeah.
Per se.
So like as far as Washington goes, you haven't ran into anyone who's like, "Oh, you went to the Barry
no.
Harrison Cemetery? That was my great grandfather."
No,
what are your videos about it?
Not yet. I really wish to, though, because I would love to get any information on any of the farmhouses I've been to, and even if I could see a picture of it that was taken in the early 1900s or something, just to see what it looked like.
Yeah.
And see what the family looked like living there, what the house on the inside looked like, things like that would be invaluable. But no, I have yet to find really anything historically tied to the farmhouses.
But you have found some very unique ones, and there's the Playhouse.
Yes.
Or whatever. I think that's the one with toys, as well as is that a drawing book?
Yes, Deborah's notepad.
Yeah.
I still remember that to this day. That's episode 25 or episode 26.
That was early on.
Yes.
What were the drawings of?
It just looked like the person, the last family that lived there. There was a woman named Deborah that had a sketch pad, and she drew all kinds of stuff, animals, people. She was just an artist herself and left her sketch pad, and there was a lot of stuff in that house left behind.
It seemed like there was a creepy rocking horse or something. And
yes.
Some kind of dolls and games. And...
Yes, which did make the house pretty creepy, and not to mention, but it was really windy out there when I was out there filming that day.
And you have to paint the picture too. It's old wood. It's brown wood, but then with these toys in it, so it looks like a cowboy house, but
it was one.
But
it was one of the newer abandoned houses. Their appliances were 80s, mid 80s, early 90s appliances. So it was
some of the toys looked like they were from the 1950s
and
the
I think
1880s.
I think that was Funhouse. I think so. For anybody that's listening, if they check out Funhouse, I think
I said Playhouse.
Yeah, I went there twice, because I went there once and took some pictures and some videos, and then I went home and I was thinking about it, and I was like, geez, I wish I took a picture of every one of Deborah's sketches on her sketch pad. And so I went back. So it was a 2-day adventure going to that house.
And then another one that's pretty interesting is the Father's Day house.
Yes.
Is that right? Like, and that was the girl who invented Father's Day lived with a single father.
Yes,
maybe?
there in the house.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting house, and I have like 5 episodes.
Yeah.
Different episodes about that. I've done revisits and different edits, and her name was Sonora Dodd, and she's buried in Spokane, and she was known as the mother of Father's Day. Her and her father and her siblings lived in that house, actually, and her mother died in that house giving birth to her youngest brother.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, her father struggled and toiled on, eking out a survival out in the harsh climate out there in Creston,
Mm-hmm.
just being a farmer. And he managed to take care of all of his kids himself and, raise them up. And she really respected him for that and was pretty annoyed that there was a Mother's Day but not a Father's Day. So she petitioned the government and various agencies and whatnot, and eventually the president recognized Father's Day.
Do
And
you know
it
who the
originated
president was at
in
the time?
Spokane. I can't remember off the top of my head. No, but I talk about it.
1892.
But I talk about it in a few of my episodes. Holiday House, and then there's the Sonora Dodd episode. So
Yeah.
if anybody looked those up, they can get
No
all
Name
the information.
Explorations on YouTube.
Yes, it's been quite the adventure going and finding all these old pioneer houses and pioneer cemeteries, and
Yeah.
it has really been an eye-opener in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about it, just like at a point you're just like looking up spots on private property and kind of, but it's in open farm country in the middle of a wheat field and there's no one around for miles, and you just want to instantly go film the things and document the things. But do you run into some confrontations?
The danger of there is a danger there. I don't feel so much so when I'm going to the cemeteries. It's like I said, most of the farmer cemeteries, they're right off of a road.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a gate where you can walk in. And, I don't really have any problems. The houses can be a little more... I'm a little more fearful of confrontation when it comes to the houses. Because, yes, for example, like Fun House, I really had to go on somebody's I went pretty deep, in the middle of nowhere to get there. And yes, it's somebody's property. And while I mean no harm, if a farmer showed up in his truck with a shotgun in his hand, I'm not going to be necessarily surprised. And I understand, because the houses are very sacred to me, and I see that they are probably pretty sacred to a lot of the farmers that live out there too.
Yeah.
It's not just that it's their property. They probably mean something to those farmers as well. So I'm very aware, but no, I haven't had any bad confrontations yet. Through,
and actually some friendly ones. Right?
Yes, actually friendly ones. People have
gotten
given
a
me
ride
some
here and
rides.
there. And we should talk about that. Just that at times you've walked, ridden a bus and then walked how many miles and how many miles back. And
my longest walk was about 44 and a half miles in a day.
Yeah.
And I was about 22 miles one way and 22 miles back.
Yeah.
And yes, and I can take buses, and I generally can walk about 10 to 30 miles when I go on my walks to try to find some of these cemeteries and farmhouses. And I also have a channel sponsors that will give me rides. Friends that enjoy what I'm doing and don't mind taking me to 5 or 6 of them.
Or maybe sometimes getting dropped off but having to walk back.
Yes, and just different things like that. People help me out. And one of my rules, though, is I generally don't take rides to the farmhouses because, as we've discussed, the it tends to be on property that's more questionable, to be private and so on and so forth. And I just like to be a little more quiet about when I go to photograph
them. Did that
them.
play a role in, the shift from farmhouses and cemeteries to more strictly cemeteries lately?
You could say so.
Maybe a little factor anyways.
Yeah, it's definitely, and like I've said as well, there is a lot more cemeteries than farmhouses too. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I can continue, in which I will continue to branch out in Washington State and find more abandoned farmhouses and churches and schools and, different things like that. But yeah, it's definitely easier to go film various cemeteries than it is the farmhouses. But on my channel, I have quite a few that I haven't been to yet or put on my channel that I still plan on going to, because I'm still looking at the maps, and I still have a couple dozen farmhouses pinged on my maps that I just haven't gone to yet. And maybe this year, maybe next year, but eventually I'll go to them too. So there'll be a lot more farmhouses coming up in the future to go along with the cemeteries. Because, yeah, they're very important. One of my favorite, most interesting farmhouses I went to that I enjoyed personally was, I called it Sinking House on my channel. And it's because, sometimes things happen and you don't build a house in a very good spot. And somebody, like we talked about, they like to build their houses next to draws because it helps, They like to be next to a water source. Well, in this instance, they built this house too close to the draw. And from what I'm seeing, it looks like they had a couple really good winters out there, which flooded the house. And it turned the ground that the house and the foundation was on into mud and silt, basically. And it just slowly started sinking into the ground. So now, when you go out there, you could barely crawl through the front door on all fours because so much of the house is buried now. So what I did was I climbed through a second-story window, and I was in the room.
Yeah.
And if that makes any sense, if you look at my channel, and
the second-story window is now like
on 5 feet
level.
above the ground. Yes. So you can crawl into the second story, like that. And so that was pretty interesting. And that's why they had to abandon it, because it started sinking and there was no way they could move it. And devastating stuff happened like that to the farmers out here when Washington State was being founded and built. It wasn't just the infant and child deaths, it was just this harsh climate where dreams were destroyed here. Yeah, you could just put it that way.
I think that's maybe the most interesting thing to me is the with these locations, like you do imagine the lives that these people lived here, and just like the what a day-to-day life would have been as well. So yeah, something like it was too wet, it was too dry for a few years, that could like devastate your family or something.
Your whole family, your whole life savings, and then what do? There's no welfare. You're out in the middle of nowhere.
Travel how far to get what simple items. And then when I was asking you about like rich and poor houses, like either way, whether you're rich or poor, you're still just kind of in the middle of some fields.
Yep.
So rich or poor, you can still go hang out by the creek or, I don't know, throw crab apples at each other. But I guess the rich people could afford probably like color crayons or something. Oh, those kids got to play with color crayons.
Right, well, and I think that's why so many people stuck to their faith out in those it was like entertainment. Well, like and it's all they had. It was so unpredictable. We haven't even talked about the fires in the summer. Yeah, when before there was a fire station. I mean, if something caught on fire, it was over there. There's at least a dozen ghost towns in the area that I've explored in Washington State that are ghost towns because there was a big fire that just
Sure.
wiped everything out,
Sure.
took everything down. And that happened very often as well. So people were used to just losing everything. And then, like I said, I think the Dust Bowl affected this area too.
Yeah.
And there was somewhere in Washington State's history during that time where there was a drought for a really long time. And I think that's what killed little ghost towns like Old Washington, for example,
Sure.
which is I just put a new episode up on my channel about Mold, Washington just yesterday. And I think that's what did them in. There were some fires up in that area, but also there, people were out there, and these farmers depended on a good snowy winter in order for them draws and creeks to have water in the spring and summertime for their crops. And when you had those winters with no snow,
Yeah.
and then they, all it takes is 1-2 years, and they lost everything.
And then a thing like, so that's pretty kind of like big picture, but even just little picture of just like, you're done working at whatever time. Maybe you worked sun up to sundown, and then you're like, your clothes are dusty, but it's not that easy to wash them.
Yeah.
So you just bang them against the outside of the house, bang your overalls or something, and wash them in the creek and hang them out to dry. And then like, what are you doing for Christmas? Hey, I got you a bucket of lard, honey.
Yeah, and it's like endless hard work in the spring and summer and fall, when it's like doing home repairs, setting the garden up, harvesting. But then what I often think about when it comes to those farmer families back in the 1800s up here was what they did with their winters, because they were stuck in those tiny farmhouses with each other as a family, like
play
literally
cards,
literally just trying not to starve and trying to stay
read the
warm.
Bible and throw cards into a hat.
And I mean, they used like they had fireplaces to stay
you're like
warm.
You're a 14-year-old boy or girl, and you're going to church. But it must have been like going to a Led Zeppelin concert.
Yes, every Sunday they looked forward to it.
Yeah, and then you meet the neighbor boy or the neighbor girl, and like, oh, get acquainted there,
and
going to the barn dance,
lighting the gas to heat the water up to have a bath, and just all these
I've even done this with like share bath water.
Yes, I mean they had to do what they
all right,
had
I
to
took
do.
the hot bath. You can have my old bath water and bathe in that.
It must have just been. It must have just got hard sometimes though, because I'm sure most of them just stayed in the living room. I mean, I just don't see anybody when
winter.
It's 10 degrees outside and 28 degrees.
I'm gonna go sledding.
Yeah.
Fuck you are.
Or you don't even want to go upstairs and be in your bedroom.
Yeah.
Everybody probably
The
huddled
heat's
up
all
in
here.
the living room, and they all had to be together, and there were no phones, no TV.
Yeah.
I mean, was there even a radio maybe? I mean, I wonder what they did to pass the time, play cards, drink hot chocolate, just all these mysteries.
Tell stories, but yeah, especially just, I don't know, I guess school, like, you just kind of, like, went to 8th grade, if you did at all in some of these places, I guess, but, like, then it's like, well, I guess it's time I start working on the farm more, pulling my weight around here.
Yeah.
And, like, yeah, some daughters just like, well, I'll knead dough with Ma now. And
yeah, just what
pancakes in the morning. And
a fascinating darn those socks. A fascinating hard life they lived. If anything, for the weather, if you haven't been up here in the Pacific Northwest, up here on these plateaus in the Coulee area, it's hard to explain just how harsh the weather could really be here year round.
And there's something too, I mean, just applying it to our modern lives is just like, oh man, like, they had to travel how far by what means to like get a bucket of lard and a barrel of flour, or hair tonic, or like cough syrup,
Yeah,
or
and they were just so strong.
any medicine at all, or any ingredient at all, and like getting some cinnamon or something was probably like
A huge
little
thing.
cinnamon on your toast. We got to ration this cinnamon.
Yeah, all winter.
Yeah,
You can only go to the store
all
twice
year.
this year.
Yeah,
And it was, and just any kind of disaster can happen.
So then after watching your videos and then being like, and then going into the bathroom and just throwing, using shampoo and soap and laying in a bed and putting my head on a pillow, and like it does make you a little grateful.
Especially in the winter time in this area. Just because they
turn
must
up
have
the
been cold.
Thermostat. My thermostat's from like the 50s or the 60s or something, but it works. I turn it on and the baseboards get hot. So.
Yeah, they were used to being cold, especially if you were poor. Not everybody was able to afford to have
2 pairs of long johns.
Yeah.
A few long sleeves on. Yeah.
Not everybody was able to afford to have a truckload of wood dropped off on their front porch before the winter time, and it ain't like there was wood all over the place for them to get when they came here. So it was just I'm still amazed at how we settled the area here. It's just a marvel of humanity to me, how people came and claimed this unclaimable land, this unlivable land.
Yeah.
So being the life out of it.
How many tens or 100 miles or however far away from a hospital and stuff. Yeah, infant mortality, not having just like aspirin and basic things laying around, probably not even having like the knowledge, let alone having like hand soap to wash your hands once in a while.
The amount of mothers that died during childbirth because there was no birth control.
You get a scratch and like it gets infected and just
what
don't
do?
have. There's no Neosporin in the cabinet, so yeah. So people die and they get buried in cemeteries, and at the time it's like, shit. If somebody dies in January, that has to be like, God damn it! Why do you have to die in January? You can't dig.
Yep.
You can't.
And so they probably kept them in a box outside and kept them frozen until the thaw. It was, it was a harsh life. They were really strong
Find
people.
their own gravestone, chisel it themselves.
Yep, like, and you could find those still to this day in some of those cemeteries.
Yeah,
they're human chiseled
some of your videos show these like the way they would carve numbers into the stones would be really interesting. There'd be it would look like runes, like RUNES, like like triangle sharp angles for like a 4 or a R.
Well, and then the different languages. When I was out at the Finnish cemetery, just seeing their writing and their language chiseled into all their headstones. There's nothing English. It was all, but there were Bible verses and stuff etched on some of the stones, but it was in like Finnish writing. And then in Odessa, when I went to one of their cemeteries in Odessa, it was mostly German, and it had Bible verses and all this stuff in that chiseled in that German writing.
Do you have a concept as far as Washington goes, as Washington State goes, of the like oldest date you've seen on a stone?
The oldest date I've seen.
Have you ever seen a born 17 something?
Under 10, I would say, born in the 1700s. Mostly it's early 1800s. You'll find anywhere from, like, the oldest would be anywhere from 1805 to 1830. Tend to be a lot of, like, the oldest ones. But yes, you'll find a 1789 every once in a while. Yeah. And,
that's pretty wild.
Yes, but it's not super common.
Yeah.
It's a lot because we said, there was a certain time.
Yeah.
when Washington.
No one was dying in 17 something something, but some of
Yes.
them were born in 17 something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is really wild. Yeah, 1795 to 1865.
And these farmer cemeteries are really interesting because, like we talked about, as agriculture goes into fewer and fewer hands, it leaves behind a lot of these cemeteries, because now what once was 50 farms that encompassed farmhouses and maybe 5 or 6 cemeteries that, you know, the farmers in these 50 farms were buried in. Once that shrinks down to 3 farmers, these cemeteries just kind of get left there and abandoned.
Yeah,
So
well, there has to be a point where it's like, you know, hey Bill, you gonna go mow the cemetery? No, I'm playing Xbox or something. Like the family's eventually just not gonna, like, I don't even know these
well,
people.
in a lot of cases that already is the case.
Yeah, so they just get overgrown. I know
Yes.
you've had to kick your way through some bushes to find some hidden
Yes.
gems in there.
And there's even some of them, because like I said, a lot of them are just on the side of the road, but there's some that are right in the middle of multiple wheat fields,
Yeah.
which also leads me to believe that in that area somewhere there probably were different farmhouses standing at one time that have since fallen down or got taken down, and then that's just been covered by wheat fields and stuff too, because there'll be just a cemetery but just absolutely nothing
Well,
around
it's funny because
it but wheat fields.
our history here is fairly recent. Like, the 1800s is like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the East Coast being settled in whatever 14, 15, 1600s
Yes.
and like stuff. So like, and then you look at Europe and it's like thousands of years ago, and they'll just be like, oh, we were gonna like build a new sidewalk, but we found this ancient Roman fresco of a, like, it's some beautiful tile thing that led into a bathhouse and stuff, and it's just in there's like a Starbucks right there.
Yeah.
But like under the Starbucks is some ancient shit that's just under the ground. It just gets buried. It just gets sediment on it.
But then, ironically enough, too, it was such the state of Washington was the Wild West for so long, though, that nothing was really being recorded. Yeah, nothing was really being recorded.
Yeah,
up until a certain.
I'm really
point
fascinated
in
by
time.
that, because the Europeans came from the East Coast west, and also from the West Coast east. But they didn't fuck with the Cascades, so this eastern Washington, Oregon, Idaho area was like, it was like, that's where it all caved in.
Yeah.
On the last of the Wild West. So yeah,
And
the
absolutely,
last of the pioneers.
And absolutely,
so people were here
land.
In 1870. They were living here while they were, like, I don't know, drinking champagne in Baltimore or something, or somewhere back east. Boston and New York or whatever. So,
but in records were hardly kept, just like the town of Mold, Washington.
Yeah,
I'm not even positive it's a town, but I got a little bit of information that it was at least a community.
Yeah,
that they called Mold,
it's a
but
congregation.
there's no information on it.
Yeah,
there's nothing.
Yeah.
Even the people that are buried there,
Even
I can't find any
old
information.
State records.
There's nothing.
Whatever.
I found a couple Spanish-American War veterans there, a Civil War veteran. So it was just another refuge, I think, during that time, during, post-Civil War and stuff like that. There were so many people that just wanted to get out of that chaos after all the big battles and stuff, and everything got destroyed.
Yeah,
veterans,
any number
and
of reasons.
people
Just keep moving
were
away.
just trying to get away.
Just don't
from
look
it.
behind. Just don't look back, because something's gonna get you.
Yeah, like they just didn't care. Like, okay, I'm up here on this plateau and it's freezing cold, but at least there ain't no war.
Yeah,
At least nobody's
the government's way
bothering me.
behind me. Everyone's
Yes.
way behind me.
So it's a lot of rebels that came. Washington State was formed by rebels and outcasts, and people fleeing for their freedoms or people fleeing to escape trouble. It was an outlaw rebel state in its infancy.
All right. Well, let's pick this up in part 2.
Awesome. This is part 1, the origins of
Yes.
no-name explorations.
All right. No Name Explorations on YouTube.